Hello and welcome to Unacademy IAS English, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good morning and welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's take a look at the topics that we are going to discuss today. From the Delhi edition of the Hindu, I have chosen 8 important articles for a detailed analysis. So let's take up these articles one by one and cover them comprehensively so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. If you guys are benefiting from this initiative, do extend your support by pressing the like button. Do share the video with other aspirants and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So let's look at the first article that we are going to discuss. On page number 12, the Hindu carries a column regarding taxing the ultra-rich or the high net worth individuals in order to reduce income inequality. So we are going to discuss this topic in detail, but before that, we have a very important announcement. Unacademy has launched new batches for 2025 aspirants. These batches are available in English medium, Hindi and as well as for bilingual medium students. So if you wish to enroll for the program, please contact the number provided over here, and this would be a 15-month subscription and the classes are available at a discounted price of 24,999. It's a limited offer. The offer ends tomorrow on the 8th of July, after which the prices are going to increase. So should you wish to enroll for the classes, do contact the team. And we also have optional classes which are being conducted by our top expert faculties. In the English medium, we have Mukesh Jha sir taking geography, Abhishek Mishra sir taking up history, and Hima Bindu ma'am taking up anthropology. So do contact the team if you wish to enroll for the optional classes as well. So with this, let's begin with the first article and talk about the core argument being presented by the writer Suresh Sheshadri. The writer is talking about income inequality in the world, how the ultra-rich, the high net worth individuals have concentrated more wealth in their hands, and why there is a need to tax the ultra-rich, to impose a minimum tax on high net worth individuals, which can generate more revenue for the governments. This is the core point being raised by the article. So first, let's understand the context. In which context has this article been published by the Hindu? See, recently, Brazil, which is holding the G20 presidency, it commissioned a report under the chairmanship of a popular French economist, Gabriel Zucman. Gabriel Zucman is a leading economist who has studied income distribution, wealth accumulation, and taxation policies around the world. So based on his expertise, a commission was set up by Brazil, which is heading the G20 presidency, to discuss income inequality and to come out with reforms, global reforms through the G20, which can help increase tax revenue for governments, which can be used for social welfare programs. So this commission, under French economist Gabriel Zucman, has submitted its report to the G20. And in a couple of weeks from now, the G20 presidency under Brazil will take up this issue for discussion. So finance ministers of the G20 countries are going to participate, including India's finance minister, Nirmala Sitharaman. It's in this context that the topic becomes very relevant for us, especially for our exams. So let's understand what is the recommendation provided by the French economist and what is the rationale behind taxing the billionaires, taxing the high net worth individuals. Let's dive deep into this topic and understand all the related points about this important issue. See, first you need to understand about income inequality that exists in the world. Recently in India, there was a report that was published that was titled The Billionaire Raj in India. In fact, we had discussed the findings of these reports as well in our previous sessions. According to this recent study conducted in India, the top 1% in the country, they own majority of the wealth and assets, whereas the bottom poor, they hardly own any wealth and assets. There is a a very drastic income divide, wealth divide in the country. This is not just the case in India. This is the case in most parts of the world. Even in developed economies, there exists a stark inequality where the ultra rich, the top 1%, the top 0.1%, they hold most of the wealth and the assets, and the bottom 50% barely own any wealth or generate any income. This contrasting income divide and wealth divide is a developmental issue. It's a pressing developmental issue. If you look at the findings of the World Inequality Report, which is published by World Inequality Lab, it highlights the divide that I'm talking about. According to the 2022 report, the World Inequality Report published in 2022, the poorest half of the global population, that is the bottom 50% of the global population, they own just 2% of the global wealth. Now compare this with the wealth owned by the top entities, the top individuals. The richest 10% of the global population, they own 76% of the global wealth and assets. Now just look at the stark divide that exists over here between the rich, the ultra rich and the poor. So in order to reduce this gap and to prevent the concentration of wealth, you need to tax the ultra rich. You need to implement progressive taxation, which is the bedrock of any democratic society. If you look at the Indian Constitution as well, under the directive principles, the state is mandated by the Constitution to work towards reducing the concentration of wealth. Please find out which article is this, which article under DPSP talks about reducing the concentration of wealth and ensuring equitable distribution of resources. Please mention that article in the comments below. So there is a justifiable, rational, a logic that exists to tax the high net worth individuals, the ultra rich, so that more revenue can be generated for the governments. And governments can use this for welfare programs, to fund infrastructure development, to provide for food security, to provide for better healthcare, better education. The governments can use the generated revenue to provide for sustainable development and welfare in the country. So that is the rationale behind taxing the ultra rich, because there exists a stark income divide. There is a huge contrast that exists with regard to the wealth owned by the ultra rich and the assets owned by the poor population. Not just in our country, but around the world, this happens to be the trend. According to World Inequality Report, the highest levels of inequality is reported in the MENA region, in the Middle East, North Africa region. This is where the highest levels of inequality is reported, and it is one of the most unequal regions in the world. The gap between the rich and the poor is at its peak in the Middle East and North Africa region. The lowest divide exists in Europe, in the developed countries of Europe. You find the lowest levels of inequality, but doesn't mean inequality doesn't exist in Europe. Even in developed countries, industrialized economies as well, there is a stark income and wealth divide, but the extent of the divide is less, relatively. If you look at India, India has been rated as one amongst the most unequal countries in the world. I was talking about the recent Billionaire Raj report brought out in India, which talks about the top few companies and individuals and families in India owning majority of the wealth and assets, whereas the bottom half, they barely own any wealth. So there is a huge income and wealth divide that exists in our country as well, which creates the rationale for taxing the ultra rich. Because if you look at the contemporary taxation rates around the world, effectively the ultra rich individuals are paying very less tax. I'll come to the exact numbers in a short while. We'll discuss what are the current tax rates around the world, what kind of taxes are being paid by the ultra rich, and how it is against the principles of progressive taxation. But first, please understand that countries are becoming richer. Several countries are generating growth, they are improving their GDP numbers. So countries are becoming rich, but governments are becoming poor. What does this mean? This is an anomaly. Countries are generating wealth, GDP growth is taking place, but governments are not making the money. Government revenue has not gone up. This is the case in India. This is the case with rest of the world as well. If you compare the GDP growth of nations and the wealth that they are adding with the revenue being collected by the government, there is a clear anomaly that comes out. This is because the ultra rich are not being taxed enough, which is directly affecting revenue collection for the government. So if governments do not have adequate revenue, how will they provide for welfare? How will they fund all the welfare initiatives and developmental programs? So this has been a global trend in the last 40 to 50 years. In the era of globalization, we have seen countries becoming richer with governments becoming poorer relatively in terms of tax revenue. So this is where the rationale comes out, the logic comes out to tax the ultra rich, to impose a separate tax on high net worth individuals. So in this context, let's look at the proposal tabled by the French economist Gabriel Zucman. Let's see what Gabriel Zucman is talking about. If you look at the report, the proposal states that Gabriel Zucman is recommending a 2% tax on high net worth individuals, which can be implemented at the global level through the G20 countries. G20 would be the right platform for implementation of any such tax proposal. Just one or two countries doing it will not help. It has to be a collective global effort where countries through the G20 agree to impose a common minimum tax on high net worth individuals. This is similar to the proposed minimum corporate tax to impose a minimum tax on multinational corporations. On similar lines, a 2% minimum tax standard is being proposed by this committee, which was commissioned by the G20 presidency, which is now with Brazil. So Brazil is going to host this year's G20 summit, and in a couple of weeks, this proposal will be discussed by the finance ministers of G20 countries under the leadership of Brazil. So this minimum tax amount levied annually on the wealth and assets owned by the ultra rich individuals who own wealth and assets in excess of $1 billion. This is likely to generate significant tax revenue for governments, which can be channeled for welfare and development. So according to Gabriel Zucman, based on studies, the right criteria would be to identify the high net worth individuals by taking into account their wealth and assets. So the bracket that the economist has proposed is $1 billion and above. Those who have wealth and assets in excess of $1 billion and above, they should be taxed at a minimum rate of 2%. And this is going to generate $200 to $250 billion a year for governments around the world. There is an alternate proposal as well to bring more billionaires and millionaires under the tax bracket by taxing those with a wealth of more than 100 million. If this is done, then more individuals will be brought under the tax bracket, bringing in an additional $100 to $140 billion in tax revenue, which means around $300 to $350 billion or even more than that can be collected by governments, which can be very crucial to fund welfare programs and development initiatives. So this significant tax revenue will play a big role in reducing the income divide and the developmental gaps that are being noticed around the world. So that is why there is a logic, a rationale that exists for levying these taxes on the ultra rich. So right now the question is, if ultra rich have to be taxed, if a minimum tax has to be imposed on them, does that mean they are not paying any taxes as of now? Right? So we need to examine the current taxation rates. Effectively, what percentage of wealth is being taxed with regard to billionaires and the high net worth individuals? That is what we need to understand. For this, we'll take the help of the Global Tax Evasion Report 2024, which was published by the EU Tax Observatory. According to this study, high net worth individuals, that is essentially the global billionaires, effectively they are paying a taxes of just 0 to 0.5% of their wealth. Now, can you tell me what is your tax rate effectively? Let's say you are earning 8 lakh rupees, 12 lakh rupees, or let's say 15 lakh rupees and above. What is the tax rate at which you are being taxed by the government? it is anywhere between 5% to 30% and above. That is the effective tax rate just with regard to income tax. But when it comes to high net worth individuals, believe it or not, the effective tax rate is just at around 0 to 0.5%. Of course, it can be argued that even a 0.2% tax on high net worth individuals will yield more tax revenue. Correct. But this does not provide for progressive taxation. So you need to understand the concept of progressive taxation. What is progressive taxation? Why is it so important? See, in any progressive economy, in any democratic society, it's important to create a more equal status, equal order. And this can be done through progressive taxation. That is, as your income increases, as you generate more wealth, your tax rate effectively should also increase, which means you have to contribute more taxes for the welfare of the nation. That is what happens in countries like India or even in other Western countries as well. For example, in India, the effective tax rate for someone whose income is just 3 lakh rupees and for someone whose income is 30 lakh rupees, there is a stark difference, right? For someone under 5 lakh rupees, the tax implications are almost 0%. Whereas for someone with an income of 30 lakh rupees, the tax implication can go up to 30% and beyond. So this is essentially progressive taxation. As your income increases, as your income level goes up, you are expected to pay more taxes with higher taxation rates. This is the underlying principle of progressive taxation, right? This is what helps in creating a more inclusive, equitable society. It will create a mechanism for distribution of wealth. It will prevent concentration of wealth at the top. It will help the governments to channel that revenue generated through tax collection from the ultra rich towards the welfare of the poor. This is the very core concept that underlies a welfare society. But if ultra net worth individuals are paying only 0.0 to 0.5% of taxes, then that is not true progressive taxation. Studies have shown that since 1980s, the wealth owned by the ultra rich has increased by 4 times. In 1987, according to studies, the global wealth assets owned by the ultra rich was around 3% of the global GDP. The top 0.0001% of the individuals, the richest of the rich, they owned around 3% of the global GDP in wealth. Now, can you estimate what amount of wealth currently is owned by the ultra rich, by the same ultra rich individuals? 40 years later, in 2024, they are owning more than 13% of the world GDP, which means their control over global wealth has increased by more than 4 times. How many of you can state the same, that your wealth, your income has increased by 4 times? If you take the average growth in income rates for an average adult, the increase accounting for inflation is just at around 3.2% a year. This is what average people like you and me make. This is the wealth increase that we see accounting for inflation. But the same for ultra rich individuals is at 7.1%. Even after repeated economic crisis situations, be it the 2008-2009 financial crisis, be it the crisis triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic, despite all these financial crisis situations, the ultra rich have made more wealth. During the crisis situation, they might have seen a small dip in the total wealth and assets. But immediately after that, when the economy stages a recovery, right, that is when the ultra rich make maximum profits through shares and through their investments. The income jumps significantly. And we have seen this happening repeatedly after every economic crisis situation. So as a result, over the last 3 to 4 decades, the ultra rich, the top 0.0001% of the world, their wealth levels have gone up by more than 4 times. The control of the assets that they have, of the global wealth and assets, has jumped by more than 4 times. So this is the inequality which is a matter of concern for any developing nation, even for that matter for a developed country. So that is where the rationale exists to implement a progressive taxation structure so that the effective tax rate on the ultra rich can increase, so that it will contribute more tax revenue to the governments, which can be channeled towards welfare programs. If you look at any democratic society, any modern civilized democratic inclusive society, progressive taxation is absolutely critical to prevent the concentration of wealth. So that is the reason why economist Gabriel Zucman and few countries which are supporting the proposal, they are arguing for a minimum tax standard on high net worth individuals at a rate of 2% for those who own wealth above $1 billion. The other alternate proposal is to tax even millionaires, those who own wealth in excess of $100 million, to tax them so that at least around $350 billion in additional revenue can be generated, which can help governments to provide for welfare programs and development initiatives. So I hope you have understood the entire argument here. So this is an argument which is very relevant in the Indian context as well. So now let's understand which countries are supporting the proposal and how is it relevant for India, what is India's position on this. See, in 2021, there was a historic decision taken by several countries under the leadership of the United States. The US and many other countries, including India, they proposed a global minimum corporate tax at around 15%, so that multinational corporations can be taxed at a minimum of 15%, so that we can deter them from moving towards zero tax jurisdictions. Because there are few jurisdictions like, let's say, Mauritius, for example, which is a tax haven. These tax havens, right, they either have very low tax jurisdictions or zero tax jurisdictions in order to attract the large MNCs to bring investments into their country, which will help these small economies sustain and survive. You also have Cayman Islands, the Cook Islands, Liechtenstein, Mauritius and many other jurisdictions which have declared themselves as a tax haven or as a low tax or zero tax jurisdiction. So many MNCs, they channel their funds through these low tax jurisdictions to avoid paying higher corporate taxes in other countries. This has deprived many governments of tax revenue. That is why the governments were getting together under the leadership of the United States, and they adopted a historic decision in 2021 to work towards this proposal of implementing a global minimum corporate tax. This decision has not been implemented yet. It has not been implemented yet, but countries are working towards it. So on similar lines, if there can be a global agreement on imposing a minimum standard tax of 2% on the ultra rich, that could also generate additional revenue for the governments. It's in this context that we should understand this particular topic. If you look at the contemporary taxation systems, they are not taxing the wealthy individuals appropriately. Progressive taxation is not being seen, even in the case of India. Even in the case of India, if you look at the ultra rich in the country, the millionaires and billionaires, their effective tax contribution is very less as compared to the wealth and assets that they are owning. You and me are paying much higher taxes as compared to, I'm not saying in terms of value, I'm saying in terms of percentage, in terms of the income that we are making and the percentage of taxes that we are paying, right? We are paying a higher tax rate, effective tax rate, as compared to certain high net worth individuals. So this is not just unfair, but it could lead to an unsustainable economy where there is wealth concentrated in the hands of very few people, leaving very little behind for the rest of the population. So to prevent that, many countries have gotten together. Brazil is of course supporting the proposal. It was Brazil which set up this commission under the chairmanship of French economist Gabriel Zucman to study the idea and come out with a viable proposal. So this proposal will be discussed during the finance ministers meeting of the G20 under Brazil's presidency. And Brazil is getting the support of other socialist and progressive countries like France, Spain, even Colombia, Belgium, African Union and South Africa. They are all backing this proposal. Now this is very important because South Africa is going to host the next G20. South Africa is part of the Troika, the G20 Troika, which currently includes India as well, because India hosted the previous G20 summit. So currently India, Brazil and South Africa, three developing nations, the IBSA countries, are holding the Troika of the G20. They comprise the Troika of the G20. Plus, thanks to India's efforts African Union became a member of the G20 last year, right? So there is adequate representation of the global south. There is adequate representation of the developing nations which are concerned about rising economic and income inequalities in their countries. So no wonder they are supporting the proposal, and even the United States has an alternate proposal to tax the ultra rich, those who own wealth in excess of $100 million. There is a minimum income tax proposed by President Joe Biden. The US has said it may not be able to support the G20 proposal for a global tax on these lines, but the US might individually impose a tax on its high net worth individuals, targeting those who have wealth in excess of $100 million. So in some form, the US also is backing the idea, and India, right, would be definitely watching these developments. India would be a key participant as well in these discussions, because in India as well, as we discussed, there is a drastic increase that we have seen in economic inequalities. The report that was published recently, The Rise of the Billionaire Raj, Income and Wealth Inequality in India, it has studied the rising income inequalities over the last 30 to 40 years, and it points out how top 1% of the country own the highest wealth and assets historically as compared to previous data, compared to how the poorest and the weakest population in the country, more than 50% of the population owning very limited wealth and assets. So there is this stark divide between the rich and the poor in the country. So there is a rationale in India as well to impose a super tax or a ultra rich tax on the high net worth individuals that can create more revenue for the government. It can create more fiscal space for the government, which can be used for increased government expenditure on welfare programs. So in India, if you just want to quantify the numbers, let's say a minimum 2% tax on the ultra rich, it can generate so much tax revenue that it would be enough to fund several government programs. You take Manrega, for example, right? Manrega has been a critical social welfare scheme which has pushed money into the hands of the people in rural India. Almost twice that budget can be collected in just 1 year by imposing a tax of 2% on the ultra-rich families in India. Around 160 plus billionaire families are present in the country. A 2% minimum tax on them can generate sufficient revenue for the government to fund 2 or 3 such schemes like Manrega. So that is the kind of revenue that can be generated, which can make a considerable difference in redistributing wealth from the rich, from the ultra-rich towards the poor. So this is what you need to understand from this important article, and let's take up a practice question based on this. So let's look at the question and discuss the model answer as well. Given the growing income inequality in the world, is it feasible to tax the uber rich or the ultra rich? Bring out the recent debate in this regard and evaluate its relevance in the Indian context. See, the key to writing a good answer lies in understanding the question. If you read the question carefully, you can realize that there are 2 parts to this question, and your answer has to do justice to both the parts of the question. The first part of the question is a statement, which is stating that given the growing income inequality in the world, is it feasible to tax the uber rich? It's asking a question at the end. The statement says that there is growing income inequality in the world. So in this context, do you think it is feasible to tax the ultra rich? So it's asking your opinion along with certain facts to justify that income inequality is growing. So in the introduction of your answer, this is what you need to discuss. You can bring out the data from the World Inequality Report. Even if you don't remember the exact statistics, you can at least present the broad trends. You can state that top 1% of the world, right, they are owning most of the wealth and assets, whereas bottom 50%, they own barely any wealth and assets. They are owning just around 2% of the global wealth, whereas the top 10%, they are owning 76% of the global wealth. So just present that stark income divide, the wealth divide that exists. You can even quote the report published in India, the recent report, The Rise of the Billionaire Raj, and point out the stark income and wealth divide that exists in our country as well. So that justifies the first statement, the opening statement, and in the introduction, you can either agree or disagree with the proposal to tax the ultra rich. But ideally, you should agree with it, because the global position as well of most countries is that ultra rich need to be taxed. At least within the G20 countries, there is a consensus amongst many of them that ultra rich need to be taxed. So given the welfare priorities of a country like India, right, you need to agree with this idea that yes, ultra rich need to be taxed. For that, now you have to justify, you have to provide the rationale. You have to explain how is it justified, how is it reasonable, how is it feasible, and it's not a tax which will hurt the economy, right? You need to explain that progressive taxation is the very bedrock of a democratic society. You can even discuss the Indian Constitution, the directive principles that talk about prevention of concentration of wealth. How the directive principles direct the state to work towards redistribution of wealth and equitable distribution of resources. So this provides a constitutional backing to your answer as well. You can bring in this angle and connect that with your statement, and you can present the idea that a 2% minimum tax can generate $200 to $250 billion in wealth. This is the revenue that governments can realize. You can refer to the report of this French economist, Gabriel Zucman. You can mention that this study was commissioned by Brazil under its G20 presidency, and these are the findings of the report. So that way you're providing a solid justification for your argument along with explaining the rationale, and thus you're establishing the feasibility of such a tax. You can even mention how the effective tax rate is unfair when you compare the rich and the poor. The middle class, the lower middle classes, and even the poor are paying effectively more taxes as compared to the ultra rich. If you take the effective tax rate into account, right, studies have clearly established that effective tax rate of the ultra rich is under 0.5%. So present the data, that's how you can justify your argument, and then finally you can conclude your answer. So provide a conclusion stating how this additional revenue can help in funding welfare programs. You need to show the results. You need to show how this tax can benefit the poor. How can it help in redistribution of wealth? So you need to provide that in the conclusion. You can state that this amount of revenue, approximately, it can help governments like the Indian government to fund welfare initiatives and programs in healthcare, in education, in social welfare, etc., and thus achieve income equality and at least strive towards equitable distribution and inclusive growth. So such a conclusion would be perfectly in line with the stand that you took in the introduction. In the body you have given sufficient backing evidence, you have substantiated your argument, and this is more than sufficient to score well for such a question, right? So now try to practice answer writing for this question. Try to write an answer, and please post the answer in the comments. I'll go through the comments later. Let's see how many of you can write a good answer based on what we have studied. Now let's look at the remaining articles. Let's take a quick look. The rest of the articles are relatively smaller, so we can quickly go through them. On page number 6 and 12, we have an article referring to a disturbing disease which has been reported in Kerala. It's called the PAM, primary amoebic meningoencephalitis, also popularly called brain-eating amoeba disease. It's caused by a certain amoeba, and it primarily affects your brain tissue. So hence colloquially it is referred to as the brain-eating amoeba or the brain-eating disease. In the last few months itself, 4 such cases have been reported in the state of Kerala. In places like Kannur, Mamlapuram and Kozhikode, 3 cases were reported earlier. In all 3 cases, it was children who were affected, and all the 3 children were killed. All the 3 children lost their lives to this deadly disease. So now there is a new report from Kerala that a fourth case has been detected. Again, a child has been reported with PAM infection, primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. But fortunately, due to early diagnosis, the child is undergoing treatment and it is reported to be in a stable condition. But however, this situation can deteriorate very quickly because the fatality rate of PAM is very, very high. So let's understand what is PAM. What is this disease? Can it infect others? How does it spread? What causes this disease? What are the treatments available? What is the diagnosis method? And how can we prevent the occurrence? So let's understand these key pointers. This could be very important for prelims and even for your mains. So this disease is caused by an amoeba belonging to the strain Nigella fowleri. It's also called Nigellariasis. So it's caused by a type of amoeba that often thrives in warm, freshwater ponds, lakes and rivers. It is often found in warm waters. Is that clear? Especially in small pools of water which has stagnated over a period of time, which is unhygienic, right? Which is a breeding ground of various pathogens. And accompanied with this, if there is higher atmospheric temperature, if there is a warmer temperature in the atmosphere, it contributes to the growth of this parasite, right? And this can easily enter your respiratory tract. When children especially, that's why children are more vulnerable. When children dive into these lakes and ponds and rivers for a swim, right, and the water enters through the nose, the amoeba gets lodged in the respiratory tract, and from the nose or even from the ear as well, it can travel up to the brain and affect the brain tissue. It will start destroying the brain tissue, and hence the name brain-eating amoeba or brain-eating disease. So it doesn't exactly eat your brain, it destroys the brain tissue by traveling through the respiratory tract and even through the auditory canal. So when this contaminated water, right, when it enters the nose and ear, right, that's when the amoeba gets lodged and it can perfecate towards the brain and lead to damage to your brain tissue. Usually adults are not so affected, but children have been found to be more vulnerable. Such cases have been reported in some other countries as well. Recently, in South Korea, there was one such case. It's a very rare disease. It doesn't occur so often. But when you have more contaminated water pools, when you have more contaminated lakes, ponds and rivers, that is when the occurrence can increase. But what is interesting is that it does not spread from one person to another. It's not contagious. If you come in contact with an infected person, it will not spread automatically. All right? And what is even more interesting is that, let's say you take that contaminated water and you drink that water, you swallow it, all right? It will not affect you. Swallowing this contaminated water will not lead to the infection. There is a specific route through which the infection is spreading, which is when you dive into the lake, into the contaminated pond, or maybe a swimming pool as well. Let's say a swimming pool has not been well maintained, it has not been chlorinated, it has not been cleaned, it's not been sanitized properly. So in such warm swimming pools, if the amoeba is thriving, if the Nigella fowleri amoeba is thriving in it, and if children take a dive in it and they start swimming in it, that is when the amoeba travels up through the nose and the ear, gets lodged in the tracts and then moves up towards the brain, which then infects the brain tissue and destroys the brain tissue. So it is spreading through a specific route. Is that clear? So according to the Center for Disease Control of the United States, initial symptoms like headache, fever, nausea and vomiting are reported. But these symptoms can be associated with any other infection as well, right? So that is why initially many parents and even doctors, they don't raise the alarm, or usually they don't correctly diagnose the infection. Only when it proceeds to the next stage, where neck stiffness is reported, which means by then the brain has already been infected. By then the child will start reporting confusion, lack of attention. They report seeing hallucinations. They lose their balance as well, as they will suffer from vertigo. And eventually it will lead to coma and death. This happens within 2 weeks to 18 days. In just 14 to 18 days, most of the infected people will die. There is no standard line of treatment available, no vaccination as such. So that is why it becomes a deadly disease. It's very rare, but if it occurs, right, it can become very, very dangerous. It's very fatal. The fatality rate is very high. Almost 97% is the mortality rate of this disease. Is that clear? So what can we do? How can we prevent the spread? What should be the line of treatment? What is the method of diagnosis available? First, we should understand how the disease is spreading. Studies have clearly shown that this amoeba thrives in warm waters. So higher atmospheric temperature with stagnated pools of water is an ideal condition. That is why they thrive in these small lakes, ponds and rivers and wells where water has often stagnated. There is higher atmospheric temperature. It's in these conditions that the amoeba is thriving. So you should educate the children and adults as well. It's not that adults are completely immune, but children are found to be more vulnerable due to various factors, right? From immunity levels to even the behavioral practices, right? Children tend to dive more into lakes and ponds as compared to adults. So that could also be a reason. So there should be greater awareness. You need to educate people that they should not be swimming in stagnated pool of water, right? It might seem like a fun activity, but it can turn out to be very deadly and dangerous. So one should avoid swimming in these stagnated pools of water, especially the small ponds and lakes, right? Where the water appears to be contaminated, it's better you don't take a swim in it. Even if you want to, there are some precautionary measures. For example, you can use nose clips. Swimmers would already know about this, right? Even in swimming pools, it is advised that you use a nose plug or a nose clip. This helps in avoiding the water entering your nose canal. All right, any dangerous pathogen, right? It will not get lodged in your nasal tract from where it can proceed towards the brain. So wearing a nose clip can be a simple preventive measure. And also keeping your head high. When you're swimming, you should avoid diving, because when you dive, the water is gushing through your ear canal and your nasal tract. So avoiding diving and keeping your head above the water is also a preventive method. So as of now, there is no specific line of treatment. All right. So for diagnosis, PCR tests are used. PCR tests are useful in accurate diagnosis. So early detection is critical. But usually it's very hard because it's a rare disease. Usually parents and even doctors will not suspect the PAM infection because initial symptoms are headache, nausea, vomiting, fever, etc., which can be symptoms of any other infection as well. So that is where the crucial time is lost. But at least in places where the infection is getting recurred, like in Kerala, for example, there are few districts where it is being reported regularly. So in such cases, doctors preventively should conduct a PCR test. Early detection can help in treatment. So as of now, there is no standard line of treatment, but the CDC of the US has laid down few guidelines, and accordingly, a broad spectrum antimicrobial is being used, which is miltefosine. Along with that, azithromycin and amphotericin has been found to be quite effective in stabilizing those patients. So preventive measures are the best possible way to avoid the contamination, and authorities have to ensure that stagnated pools of water, right, they should be either cleaned up, sanitized by using chlorine, or they should prevent people from swimming in such stagnated waters. They should spread more awareness amongst children, amongst parents as well, to avoid swimming in stagnated lakes and ponds. They should encourage the swimming pools as well and public pools to use chlorine to clean up and sanitize the pools so that the growth of the amoeba can be kept under check. So these are the preventive measures, along with using nose clips, keeping your head high above the water and avoiding diving. So please make a note of all these key points. You can get a straightforward 10-mark question in mains or maybe a prelims question. So what is primary amoebic meningoencephalitis or PAM? Examine the health risks and measures needed to prevent its occurrence. So I think writing an answer to this question is not that difficult, right? It's a very straightforward question from Science and Tech. So first you begin the answer by explaining where the PAM cases have been reported in India, for example. Talk about the recent incidents in Kerala where 3-4 cases have been reported and discuss what is this disease, what causes it, how does it spread, what is the mortality rate, explain the route of transmission, then discuss the treatment and preventive measures in the body. And in the conclusion, suggest a way forward. How can we prevent? How can we spread more awareness? So that is it. Your 150 words will be up and you would have written a good answer for 10 marks. Now coming to the next article on page 14, we have an article related to Sri Lanka and the strategic competition being witnessed in the Indian Ocean between major powers like India, China, and the United States. These three major powers are competing for influence in the Indian Ocean, and there is a related article today which talks about the competition between these three powers in the Indian Ocean, which is centered around Sri Lanka. As you all know, Sri Lanka has gone through a major financial crisis, and India has been one of the countries which has helped Sri Lanka during the crisis. India has provided almost $4 billion worth of assistance in order to help bail out the Sri Lankan economy. Plus, Sri Lanka is working with the Paris Club of Creditors. It is working with the major creditors like Japan, India, and France, which are the co-chairs of this Paris Club of Creditors, which is working with Sri Lanka to restructure the loan, the debt problem that Sri Lanka is facing. So this is one development on one side. But parallelly, Sri Lanka has said that it will provide permission to foreign research vessels to dock at its port facilities. Sri Lanka has recently informed not just India but even Japan and other countries which are concerned about this development. It has informed them that it can't block foreign research vessels. It is going to give permission to foreign research vessels which are requesting for port calls, to dock at strategic Sri Lankan ports. Now let me explain why this is significant. See, recently there were few Chinese research vessels that docked at Sri Lankan ports. A Chinese research vessel known as the Yongwang 5. The Yongwang 5. It was allowed by Sri Lanka to dock at Hambantota port and also at the Colombo port. Now, when this development occurred a year ago, India strongly opposed this decision of Sri Lanka. India was on one hand providing financial assistance to Sri Lanka to overcome the debt crisis, and India expected Sri Lanka to act in our favor. But parallelly, it was allowing China to dock a research vessel at Hambantota and Colombo, which are strategic ports. Now, the concern with these research vessels is that essentially these are not research vessels. They are essentially spy vessels which have electronic surveillance equipment through which China can spy on target countries like India. A vessel like Yongwang 5, it has interception equipment which can intercept electronic communication. It can help in tracking missile launches, satellite launches. So clearly it has a intelligence purpose, a military objective, and such research vessels of China have been allowed by Sri Lankan authorities to dock at strategic Sri Lankan ports in the past. So following this, India raised a major objection. Even United States placed a major objection. And as a result, Sri Lanka withdrew the permission, and when China made another attempt to bring a few more research vessels, Sri Lanka denied the permission for these research vessels. But now Sri Lanka has said that it can no longer do this only for China. It can't block only Chinese research vessels. So Sri Lanka has said that starting from next year, if any foreign research vessel asks for permission, it is going to grant the permission for these research vessels irrespective of which country is asking for the permission. So that is what Sri Lanka has stated. So this again brings out the strategic competition that goes on in the Indian Ocean, particularly centered around Sri Lanka, where India, China and US are competing for influence against each other. So India, US as part of the Quad initiative, as they are Quad partners, they are working with like-minded countries like Japan and Australia to curb the rising military influence of China in the Indian Ocean. Parallelly, India has stepped up its investments in key strategic projects in Sri Lanka. India, for example, has gained access to develop Trincomalee, which is a major port. We are developing oil tank farms. We are developing a thermal plant at Sampur near Trincomalee port. So these are some major Indian projects which are being executed near the Trincomalee port, which is of great strategic relevance. India is refurbishing the old oil tank farms which stores oil over here, and it will actually help in energy security for both Sri Lanka and even for India. So China already has a dominating control over Hambantota port. As part of its Belt and Road Initiative, China has not only funded the construction of Hambantota, but it has even obtained a long-term lease of Hambantota, because Sri Lanka could not repay the loans that were borrowed as Hambantota project failed commercially. And China has secured a 99-year lease over Hambantota, and a Chinese company controls the operations at Hambantota. So this is seen as a strategic threat by India. Even the Colombo port and the East Container Terminal at Colombo port has been constructed with Chinese funds, and China has control over it. Recently, a Chinese company has brought fresh investments of around 400 million to expand the terminal facilities at the Colombo port. So these are matters of concern for India. So India is countering this with the West Container Terminal project at Colombo. India's Adani Group has won a contract to develop the West Container Terminal, and this was possible because of India's financial support that was given to Sri Lanka. As India helped Sri Lanka overcome the financial crisis, India secured some of these key projects, including the projects at Trincomalee and the West Container Terminal project at Colombo port. So India's Adani Group is executing this critical project, and a US company also has joined the initiative. So there is joint India-US collaboration going on as well, and even Japan was supposed to be part of such initiatives. In fact, initially, it was supposed to be India-Japan, which were supposed to take up the East Container Terminal project at Colombo. But at the last minute, the project was cancelled from India and Japan, and it was handed over to a Chinese company. So now, India has won the contract for West Container Terminal at Colombo, and a US company is also investing in the project. The US is also showing greater interest in such strategic projects in Sri Lanka, and it has committed more than $500 million for the West Container Terminal at Colombo, which is being built by India's Adani Ports Limited. It has also signed other agreements with the Port Authority of Sri Lanka to expand the port infrastructure in the country. So this again highlights the competition that goes on between the big powers, India, China and US, as far as Sri Lanka and the Indian Ocean is concerned. So that is what we learned from this article, and now we can proceed towards the prelim section and take a quick look at the smaller articles in today's newspaper. Let's look at this article from page number 1. According to this article, the Parliament has been summoned by the President of India. The President of India, who is bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, has acted upon the recommendations of the government as advised by the government, that is the Council of Ministers. The President of India has issued a summon for summoning both the houses of the Parliament, both Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, because recently elections were concluded, a new Lok Sabha has been constituted, the oath-taking ceremony also has been completed. So accordingly, the government is preparing for presenting the union budget, a full-fledged union budget of this year on the 23rd of July. Because if you remember earlier this year, an interim budget had been presented because this was an election year. So now that elections are concluded and a new government has been formed, a full-fledged union budget will be presented on the 23rd of July, and to initiate the proceedings of the budget session, the President has summoned both the houses of the Parliament. So that is the development reported over here. Now, I want to give you a small assignment. I want you to find out which are the two articles in our Constitution that is being referred to in this article. In this newspaper article, based on what I have discussed, there are two related articles in the Constitution of India. One is related to the President being bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. Because the article clearly states that on the recommendation of the government of India, the President of India has summoned the houses of the Parliament, which means President doesn't have a discretionary power. The President can't act on her own. The President is bound here by the aid and advice of the government, that is essentially the Council of Ministers. So which article in the Constitution provides for this provision? Please find this out, mention that in the comments. Next, under which article can the President summon the houses of the Parliament? So please find out both these articles, mention that in the comments below. That is a small assignment for you. Next, on page number 9, we have an article related to disaster management. There is an unfortunate situation that has developed in Assam, but this is a regular occurrence in Assam. During every monsoon season, the Brahmaputra, the mighty Brahmaputra, floods heavily and causes large-scale devastation in the downstream area, in the Brahmaputra Valley. Not just the state of Assam, but even Arunachal Pradesh, even the neighboring country of Bangladesh, they all suffer extensively due to the frequent flooding of the Brahmaputra. This is a regular occurrence during every monsoon season, right? Once the rainfall is received during monsoons, accompanied with the perennial nature of the Brahmaputra, it leads to excessive flooding in the valley areas, and especially in the downstream areas of Assam, right? Massive flooding is reported every year. So few people have been reported dead, lakhs of people have been displaced, and the disaster management authorities have already kicked into action. The Assam State Disaster Management Authority is coordinating with National Disaster Management Authority to deploy the National Disaster Response Force and the State Disaster Response Force to carry out the evacuation of the people, to conduct search and rescue operations, to search for those who are stranded and rescue the people who are stuck in the flood situation, right? So this is what we take away from this article. And also please understand that the Kaziranga National Park and Tiger Reserve, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it also gets flooded every year by the Brahmaputra, and it is a major threat for the one-horned Indian rhinoceros and even other threatened species that are found in Kaziranga, the elephants, the tigers, right? And along with the rhinos, the one-horned Indian rhinoceros, these are all threatened species listed on the IUCN Red List. So every year, few rhinos and other threatened animals are killed by the floods in Kaziranga, which is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So this flood situation that occurs every year represents a major threat for not just human life and property and infrastructure, but it represents a threat for the environment of the region as well. So better measures, better planning, better preparedness is necessary in order to mitigate the impact of the floods. The floods may not be entirely prevented, it's not entirely preventable, but at least the impact can be mitigated through better planning and preparedness as part of the disaster management measures. Next, on page number 9, we have an article referring to an indigenous light battle tank developed by the DRDO. The DRDO, which is the country's premier defense research agency, it has developed Zorawar, which is a light battle tank which weighs just under 25 tons. The Indian Army raised a requirement for a light battle tank following the clashes with China in Ladakh. I'm sure all of you remember the 2020 Ladakh clashes, and that military standoff continues even today. It has not been fully resolved. Plus, we have constant tensions with the other neighbor, Pakistan, as well. So in the Himalayan heights, we face a twin threat from China and Pakistan, particularly towards the high altitude regions, and it is a requirement for the Indian Army to be able to airlift these battle tanks and deploy them to the front lines, even in such hilly terrain, even in such high altitude areas. For that purpose, we can't use a heavier battle tank, right? We can't easily deploy the T-90s or the Arjun main battle tanks, which are much heavier in size. So Indian Army raised a requirement in 2021 for light battle tanks which weigh under 25 tons so that they can be easily airlifted and deployed at the front lines facing China and Pakistan, even in the Himalayan heights. So once the request was raised by the Indian Army, the DRDO tied up with Larsen and Toubro, L&T, which has a defense unit It's a private entity. Collectively, they have worked together to develop the Zorawar, which is India's indigenous light battle tank. As of now, it is powered by a foreign engine developed by Cummins, which is a US company. A Cummins engine has been used to power this battle tank, but going forward, it will be powered by an indigenous engine. DRDO is working on an indigenous battle tank engine. It is looking to indigenize the battle tank engine of the Arjun main battle tank. Similarly, it has launched another project to develop a indigenous engine for the light battle tank Zorawar as well. For the time being, it is powered by a foreign engine procured from the US, the Cummins engine, developed by Cummins Corporation of the US. But going forward, an indigenous light engine will be developed which will power this light battle tank. So this battle tank has been designed for versatility. It is meant to be easily deployed with minimum logistical support. Helicopters should be able to airlift them and deploy them to the front lines in the northern borders facing China and Pakistan as the situation demands. Now let's look at the next article from page number 10 that talks about right to repair. What is right to repair and what is the right to repair portal which has been launched by the Government of India? See, whenever you procure a commodity from a private producer, let's say you bought a car, or let's say you bought an electronic item from a private producer. Let's say you bought a car from Maruti Suzuki or Hyundai. Let's say you bought a TV or an air conditioner from LG or Samsung, etc. Usually, we can't repair these equipments, right? On our own, or even using a third-party service provider, we can't easily repair our air conditioners, our refrigerators, or television sets, and especially cars and vehicles. So what do? We often rely on company-provided service. So that way, companies are maintaining a monopoly on repair and service. Correct? Even though third-party vendors are available, right, who can service your vehicles and equipment, we often prefer company-offered services because we don't trust the other vendors. We are sure that vendors may not be able to easily open up the equipment. They may not have the right spare parts. They may not know the inner workings. That's because the companies don't provide the repair manual. See, whenever you buy something new, right, you get an operating manual, how to operate the equipment, but they never give you the repair manual, which tells you how to disassemble the equipment, how to repair it, how to replace the spare parts. That manual is never given. Why? Because companies would like to keep a monopoly on repair and service, which ensures that the customer is trapped with the company for the entire life cycle of the product. That's why when you leave your car for service, the bill will run up to several thousand rupees, and you have no other alternative usually, and you end up paying that money for that company. Apart from buying the car, you are paying the company again for repair and service, right? So this is where a concept has developed, a new trend, a new movement, a global movement has developed called right to repair movement. Right to repair talks about the right of the customer. It's a consumer right. It's the right of the customer, the consumer, to be able to repair, replace any spare part on their own. And for this, the companies are mandated to share the repair manual. So governments around the world are pushing for this right, and India also is implementing this in order to achieve the goal of a circular economy. In a circular economy, there is focus on repair, reuse, and recycle. This is how you can reduce your consumption. This is how we can protect our environment and ensure that the available components and material is reused and recycled in the economy. So to create a circular economy, you need to promote repair, reuse, and recycle. And in the interest of this, the government is implementing right to repair for consumers, and it's being provided as a consumer right. So for this purpose, a portal has been created by the Department of Consumer Affairs, the right to repair portal. And all the manufacturers are mandated to share the repair manuals and the details and guidelines over here, which means consumers and third-party service providers can access the repair manual. You can read how equipment can be disassembled, how your cars, your electronic items can be disassembled, how they can be repaired, and how the spare parts can be replaced. which means you no longer have to rely on these manufacturers for repair and service. You can do it on your own, or you can get a third-party cheaper vendor to do it instead of the company. So that reduces the monopoly of the companies as well. It will benefit the consumer. It will promote the concept of repair, which enables the circular economy. So this is being strictly implemented by the government. So according to this article, the Department of Consumer Affairs has asked the automobile manufacturers to join the Right to Repair portal so that they can share the repair manuals and all the details on how to repair the equipment, and thus right to repair can be provided or ensured or guaranteed to the consumer. Now coming to the last article for today, on the supplement page, we have these beautiful images of the Chandravalli cave complex in Karnataka. It's a very important topic from history, from ancient and medieval history. So you should understand why Chandravalli cave complex or the Chandravalli archaeological site is important. The Chandravalli cave complex, also called the Chandravalli archaeological site. So first, where is it located? It is located in Chitradurga in Karnataka. Please write this down. It's located in the Chitradurga district of Karnataka, and it is a prehistoric site. It is a very important prehistoric archaeological site. We have found the remains of pottery items and coins and other artifacts that date back to the Shatavahanas, the Vijayanagara Empire, the Hoysalas, and even the Kadamba dynasty, the first Kannada dynasty. We have even found an inscription, a rock inscription from the Kadamba era, dating back to the days of Mayura Sharma, the founder of the Kadamba dynasty, which represents modern day Karnataka. Here we have discovered the first capital city of the Kadamba dynasty. Chandravalli was believed to be the first capital city of the Kadambas. And we have even discovered coinage and pottery and other artifacts from the Chinese Empire and the Roman Empire as well. Coins dating back to Augustus Caesar have been discovered. Coins from the Han dynasty of China belonging to 2nd century BC have been discovered, which clearly indicates that Chandravalli was a thriving commercial center with global trade and economic linkages. So this is a very significant historical find, and it is a very important historical site, a prehistoric archaeological site dating back to the Shatavahana period. And further evidence also suggests that this site was inhabited by humans since the Iron Age. Even during the Iron Age, a human settlement is believed to have existed and survived over here, because we have found several artifacts and pottery and coinage items that dates back to the prehistoric days. So from the perspective of ancient and medieval history, the Chandravalli archaeological site in Chitradurga in Karnataka is extremely important for our exams. So on this note, I would like to conclude my discussion for today. I hope you guys have liked the session, understood everything that we have discussed. And if you did, please let me know in the comments. Do press the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So that is it for today. We will see you in the next class, and let's catch up tomorrow at 10 a.m. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.